And good afternoon, Coronarites. And this is vk3sl. We're testing here on 160 metres narrowband FM mode. Regular test missions, afternoon test missions. We're still going, and we grace the airways with a whole range of modulated sound excerpts, things too which may or may not resonate with some of the people who sit there with their Smith's charts and their ham exams, working out what should be and what shouldn't be. Anyhow, it's greetings to the grey liners as well, who may be waiting in anticipation for the excited to fail. It's sort of almost a foregone conclusion that something will happen somewhere. So I'm trying to not tempt fate with disclaimers like that. Anyhow, we are on board with our usual run-of-the-mill program, or non-program, non-entertainment. You have here the Green Brothers Novelty Orchestra on an associated Vitatone program service transcription record from the 1930s. We've got quite a selection here now, and there's a range of hi-fi options from the 1930s. So we're testing these, of course. We're getting some idea of how they sound, and it's a very interesting experience, to say the least. I'm quite captivated by these Vitatone records, using the latest Western electric gear from the 1930s. Yeah, vk3sl testing, and we shall commence. vk3sl testing on 160, and we just heard a selection from Green Brothers Novelty Orchestra, who were probably some other band, and that was their pseudonym. We don't know. And some nice vibe playing anyhow on that, or xylophone playing, and these hi-fi records certainly sound excellent for the times. All right, well, last night we started off with a performance, we finished off with a performance of Mozart's Symphony number 41 and the Jupiter Symphony. And I've been hearing it in my ears all day. It has been resonating. It's been an earworm. That wonderful fugue, that exceptional counterpoint has just prevailed. And it's one of the greatest moments in Western art music, I think, is what Mozart does with this last movement. It's just totally wondrous. It's amazing. The theme just reincarnates, it augments, it truncates, it just evolves in all sorts of wonderful ways. And it is omnipresent, and it is so exultant. And I have to play it again, I'm sorry to say, and I've found a different performance. I found a more contemporary performance, but I think we'll have another listen just to the last movement. I mean, the whole symphony is amazing, but the last movement is just something to behold. So, yeah, here we go. Time for my indulgence. vk3sl testing. Oh, that five-voice fugue. It's amazing. And the way all of the subordinate themes all combine in that coda. Oh, goodness. It's such great music. I can't help but feel reinvigorated by that. And I might have to change that to the theme music for these Corona missions. I'll have to think about that. The only problem is that I'll have to let the whole thing play each time, which wouldn't be so good because, well, it would be 8 minutes out of our usual program. But what do people say about this? There's a nice quote here from Mr. Groves. George Grove, he said, "It is for the finale that Mozart reserved all the resources of his science and all the power, which no one seems to have possessed to the same degree with himself, of concealing that science and making it the vehicle for music as pleasing as it is learned. Nowhere has he achieved more," says Mr. Grove. Oh, there's all these wonderful accounts of this work. And, it's possibly the most exultant piece of music, one of the most exultant pieces of music Mozart wrote, and he only lived for 2 years after that. Yeah, okay, we'll come back down to earth now, and we'll find something else, something totally different. I think we can't have anything that's even remotely classically oriented after hearing that piece. By the way, that was the recording of the Halle Orchestra. But I might, maybe instead of using it as a theme, I might feature different interpretations of it as a regular thing. Maybe that's a way forward. But it lives with you. it percolates. I find all day today I had that theme, that wonderful 5-note theme. All right, 4-note theme. What have we got? We have a program on electronic India. This is a very interesting subject. Just recently, some tapes have been discovered and revealing a whole aesthetic in Indian contemporary music and sort of recent in the electronic music vein. And there was an art scene exploring electronica using synthesizers in the 1960s, and it was completely, well, more or less unknown in the West, and the tapes have surfaced, and there's a documentary about the subject. It's completely fascinating. I heard some of it earlier, and I think it deserves a second playing on these missions. So, without any further ado, let's hand over to the BBCBM. This is vk3sl testing.
Beethoven Unleashed on Radio 3 in concert.
Okay, we're about to
This
start.
Monday to Friday evening at 7:30.
In this week's Sunday feature, the musician Paul Purgas stumbles on a forgotten chapter of Indian music in the vaults of a design school in the country. For him, the story of electronic music has always been dominated by the West, until now.
It's good that way. There we go. Super. This story starts, you pull it tight there, with a box of reel-to-reel tapes. Space there to get that. I found in Ahmedabad, India. Okay, I think we should be good to go. Please don't anything bad happen.
What is electronic music?
For any type of music, the basic source is sound. The music whose sound source is electronic circuitry is called electronic music.
I'd heard that in the late 60s, a design school in the city had been given a Moog synthesizer, which at the time was an astonishingly expensive instrument. And I'd gone to try and find it. When I arrived in the archive, the librarian handed me this box of tape reels, and it was clear they hadn't been touched in years. They were dog-eared and faded, but written on them in immaculate handwriting were track titles like Electronic Dance Music, Bubbles, and Space Liner, dated from 1969 to 1973. When I heard the first tape, I was completely blown away. It sounded unlike anything I'd ever associated with Indian music, let alone for that time.
Some of the names which will be remembered in the history of electronic music are Schoenberg, Varese, John Cage, Morton Feldman, Stockhausen, and David Tudor.
Indra, we would like to know, when was electronic music introduced in India?
My name is Paul Purgas. I'm an electronic musician and artist, and I was raised in Bristol to Indian parents. I grew up on the electronic music of Detroit and Berlin, and later the industrial sound of artists like Yanis Xenakis and Throbbing Gristle. I think I was drawn to the futurism of electronics, and the fact that it seemed more universal than the predominantly white rock bands. It felt like a world I could identify with. But I still always looked to the West to understand its history. And central to that history is the Electronic Music Studio. These were experimental spaces, often linked to public radio in Europe, where producers were inventing new forms of music with technology. Things like tape players, oscillators, and later, synthesizers. There was GRM in Paris, which gave birth to Musique Concrète, NWDR in Cologne, where Stockhausen composed early electronic scores, the Radiophonic Workshop in London, and studios in Bologna, Stockholm, and even Warsaw. Had I stumbled onto India's equivalent to the Radiophonic Workshop? Could this have been the birth of a sort of electronic avant-garde in India? And if so, what happened? To understand, we need to go back to a newly independent India in the 50s and the country's first design school.
The years after independence were tumultuous years because we had to set up a fledgling country.
Shilpa Das is a faculty member at the design school where I found the tapes, a place called the National Institute of Design, which is still going today. I met her on campus.
And in keeping with Nehru's vision, they realized that besides having managers and engineers, we also need to have a cadre of designers.
India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, invited the progressive American designers, Charles and Ray Eames, to tour India and make recommendations for a training programme. Their report, the India Report, came out in 1958 and proposed a radical new way of thinking about education. The National Institute of Design, or the NID as it's called, followed in 1961, guided by the same philosophy. But to understand the real spirit of the NID, we need to talk about one family in particular.
The Sarabhais are, there were many, but the two siblings who are important for us are Gautam Sarabhai and his sister Gira Sarabhai. Gautam Sarabhai was a mathematician and Gira Sarabhai was an architect who had trained for a year with Frank Lloyd Wright in Taliesin.
The NID was unusual in that it had American funding from the Ford Foundation, but was managed by a local family. And the Sarabhais were no ordinary family. Like a sort of Indian Rockefellers, they were wealthy industrialists who had an impressive address book. They lived in a white-walled villa designed by Le Corbusier in the outskirts of Ahmedabad, where they entertained some of the biggest players from the international avant-garde. People like Robert Rauschenberg, Alexander Calder, Yanis Xenakis, and John Cage, some of whom were guest lecturers at the NID. But the Sarabhais were also radicals who were close friends with Gandhi. Gautam was the chairman at the institute.
Gautam Sarabhai had always been deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's ideas of alternative educational models, also the Montessori mode of education, and of course the Bauhaus maxim of learning by doing. He sort of turned that around to learning to know and learning to do. He was of a free-thinking sort of mind. He was not in favor of education that pigeonholed students or that was too controlling. What we should aim at the institution is the institution sans institutionalization.
For each of us, we had to find our own reality.
Deepankar Bhattacharya was just 16 when he arrived to study design at the NID in 1970.
I saw a small ad in the newspaper, talking about this design school, and I didn't know what design was. I was very intrigued, and I went to Ahmedabad to check it out. And what I saw there completely floored me. The buildings, or the kind of things that were happening out there, the kind of people I was meeting, the things they were talking about, and I knew that this is it for me. I wasn't going to go anywhere else. For one thing, we were all on first name basis. Gautam Sarabhai was actually older than my father, and he insisted on being called Gautam Bhai, which for India at that time was kind of huge. And the other thing was that a voice such as mine, which was a 16-year-old's voice, was as important as a very accomplished designer. We were trying to develop a culture there where everybody's voice kind of counted.
The NID was founded on a progressive utopian vision of what education could be. The students had no formal assessments, and there was minimal hierarchy. And in the early years, students had the chance to collaborate with some of the biggest names in international design. In a country that was just coming out of the strict colonial system, this was revolutionary.
For me, design never was a profession. We were not thinking of how much we were going to earn or whether we were going to earn anything at all. So we never thought like that. We were free to dream what design could be.
I think some buildings just have the ability to change your mood. When I'm in the grounds of the NID, I feel instantly calm. The main building has a classic modernist aesthetic, built around cool concrete hallways, and it's set back from the road in a walled garden, with clouds of starlings swooping above. It's a peaceful haven from the dust and chaos of the city outside.
This is Dhan's work, by the way.
Okay,
taking the
amazing.
dot for a walk.
Shilpa showed me around.
The wood workshop and the metal workshop. This is the sound design lab.
See, basically, at the writing stage, how do you incorporate sound, right? Think about how does he look, but do you also think about how does he sound? And how does he sound individually and how does he sound to others?
The sound design lab today looks like any other soundproof studio, really. Slightly stuffy, with padded walls and no natural light.
vk3sl.
Shilpa tells me that this is where the Moog, that rare synth which initially set me on this trail, would have been kept in the 60s. But now, there's no trace of it. So, within the timeline of NID, to your knowledge, when did the Moog arrive?
I actually know very little about the Moog. But Sharma ji probably was one person who had some sort of knowledge of the Moog. He passed away long back.
S.C. Sharma was one of the composers named on the tapes I found, but he had since passed away, as had many of the people from that time. This chapter in history was disappearing, with the last witnesses who could still remember it. You should be getting signal at this point.
When was electronic music introduced in India?
First electronic music workshop in India was established at National Institute of Design, Ahmedabad in the year 1969. And the regular courses were conducted by famous performer-composer David Tudor.
There's one tape, it says Birds, electronic music prepared by Mr. David Tudor, 1969. Sibilance, strings.
I tracked down one of the remaining faculty members who had worked in the sound department at the time. This almost looks like it says Moogsical form.
Moogsical form. My name is Akhil Saxena. When I joined NID as a faculty of sound department way back in 1973, my role was to teach students or how sounds can be used in many different ways. There can be some chat shows, there can be radio programs, there can be radio jingles.
गुजरात स्टेट फर्टिलाइजर्स कंपनी की खाद इस्तेमाल करते हैं। क्यों? 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 क्यों?
Ahmedabad. City of free enterprise. Go there and see for yourself.
trains, birds, strings, cats and
organ.
Cats and organ.
Of December 1970. So Sharma spent his New Year's Eve recording this.
Correct.
Can you describe to me what the Moog looked like, and also what was it like to make music with it?
Moog synthesizer was basically 3 big boxes, like big suitcases, which were basically pulse generators, square wave, sine wave, triangular wave, and it used to have one keyboard. So everything left to you, how you want to play it, what you want to create. So in that sense, it was very experimental. On our own initiative, we used to work at the late night. Even if we are sleepy, we would get some soda and wash our face and again continue. The final take would be taken by 3:30 in the 4 o'clock in the night. For us, it's just a passion. Then the S.C. Sharma, who composed this music, is called dance music.
This tape is really incredible, actually. This was one of the later ones, so from September 1972.
72.
When I first heard this tape, it was like discovering a complete jump forward in time of what I imagined could be happening in India in that moment. It's almost like something that was happening decades later. I was just wondering, do you remember anything about any of these composers or musicians?
I was told when David Tudor came here, who stayed here for 3 months, he took classes of 4 or 5 people who were basically musically trained, like musicians by themselves. One was Atul Desai. He was an Indian classical musician. He was a music director in All India Radio. The rest of the people like S.C. Sharma and I.S. Mathur, they experimented more like in effects. They were faculty members like us, but they did not have any musical background. S.C. Sharma, basically, he was a poet. He used to also write in Indian language, in Hindi. He used to write. So he had some creative mind, and it is left at that because they just experimented for 2-3 years. Later on, nobody went ahead and did more on that. So the chapter was almost closed by 76. I have not seen Moog being used afterwards.
So as I found out, it was a pianist and associate of John Cage, David Tudor. He brought the Moog to the NID in 1969. Whilst there, Tudor taught workshops on electronic music, and many of the early tapes I discovered were recorded under his supervision. Now, India had its first synthesizer, a rare analogue system made by Robert Moog. There were 5 composers on the tapes, and as Akhil filled me in, most of them had since passed away. Apart from one person, Jinraj Joshipura, who nobody really had any info on at all. And did you have any knowledge of a composer called Jinraj Joshipura?
No, that gentleman, I don't know. I only heard his name, saw his name on the tapes, but I never met him.
We'd given up on finding him when my producer got an email. Yeah, I can't hear anything.
I can't hear.
Which led me to a video call.
I can hear him.
Lovely.
Can you hear me, Paul?
In Puerto Rico. Jinraj, I can hear you. I can hear you. That's great.
Okay.
Amazing. I've been really keen to speak to you, actually. I've been looking into the history of the electronic music studio at the NID, specifically a set of tapes that were found there. And you're the last surviving composer that was on these tapes. And I guess I just wanted to talk to you about your work there.
No, I'm thrilled. I'm absolutely thrilled that you found me.
Right. Could you take me back to the first time that you played on the Moog?
Oh, first time that was beautiful because I had never heard such sounds in my life. It was taking me 50 years into the future. I couldn't believe it. Pop, 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 pop. Ting, 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 ting. I can't even describe it. No, I can't. You hear it in the music. It's a pure electronic sound.
How did you come to study at the NID?
I started architecture. I was in the third year of architecture when I studied electronic music. I did not know what it meant. I definitely knew it was not electric guitar. The description gave that there is a new machine, which is a synthesizer, which is able to synthesize different sounds. So I was just curious. I learned about this music course from David Tudor, and I applied. I met Geeta Sarabhai and David Tudor. They interviewed me. He was very intelligent and very innovative in his work. And then I started dedicating myself day and night behind it every weekend. And being a simultaneously student of architecture, I had sound engineering, music, as well as my traditional field of architecture. I didn't sleep. Maybe I must have slept 2 hours a day for 3 months.
Okay. This show is all about shadows, and we are going to have 3 screens, 1 screen set off to the back, and 2 in front, and also we're going to have...
And don't heckle us, listen to us first.
But we don't have that much time to talk. You better...
Come on, for God's sake, let's get organized. Start talking something.
And when David brought us into the introduction of synthesizer, he showed us that this is something very different than what you have done, so that we can open up our mindset. Because if you live in India and if you just listen to Indian music, you don't know what an alternative is. The size and the scope of synthesizer and the complexity was so intimidating that some people will say, why at this age, why I have to do all this? Why I have to learn when I'm very much embedded in my tabla or sitar or sarod or whatever it is. That was the problem with the Indian scene, was everybody was very traditional and were not open. But I was an open book. I was 19 years old. I didn't have any baggage. And my approach, where everybody was trying to imitate and try to use synthesizer to create traditional sounds of sitar and guitar, I said, why are we doing that? This is a completely new world. So I imagined that I'm traveling on a space journey and I'm sitting in a space liner, and I was trying to think what kind of music or rather sound spectrum must be there out in the space. It cannot be Blue Danube composed by Strauss as in the Space Odyssey 2001. So it has to be something different. And David loved that approach because he realized that I was looking at the synthesizer from a totally different perspective.
Jinraj had some pretty wild plans for the synthesizer. He thought it could be used to translate animal communication or create an underwater language for submarines. When David Tudor left India, Jinraj wrote him a series of obsessively detailed and animated letters explaining his grand plans for the Moog. Tudor put in a good word with the Rockefeller Music Research Center in San Diego, who offered him a scholarship to study sound synthesis. What happened with that part of your life? Did that...
No, I couldn't go to Rockefeller Music Research Center. My father said, finish architecture. So that was the end of the musician. And I very, very disappointed for a 19-year-old boy, very disappointed, because it gave me a chance to go to America. And I was being fully paid. My father didn't have to spend the money, but he thought that this is crazy. You're not going to get a job after 9 months. And so he looked at it from a pragmatic way, like every Indian father. But then those opportunities don't come again. And I never had a time to reflect and go back to it. This interview, after 50 years, somebody even cared to call me and find me as valuable. That just is more fascinating than anything I've ever happened in my life. It was the best gift in 70 years. When you are working for a living, your creativity is subdued because you are dancing to other people's tune. Now I have to create my own tune and dance to it.
It was incredibly moving talking to Jinraj, not only as the last surviving composer from this time, but also to see the parallels with my own life. I had also chosen architecture as a secure profession to satisfy the pressures of an Indian family. Thankfully, in my life, I had the opportunity to explore music later on. So I felt Jinraj's sadness that his journey had ended so soon. So how did David Tudor come to crash land in the NID with such a rare synthesizer?
I have to say the Sarabhais were instrumental because they were very closely connected with the cultural scene of Europe and the United States, and they knew the artists and the designers at a personal level. As a matter of fact, the whole sound thing was because of a person called Geeta Sarabhai, who actually had an association with John Cage as early as 1946.
Geeta Sarabhai was a student of Indian classical music, but in the mid-40s she headed to New York to study composition, and whilst there she was introduced to John Cage. It was a meeting of minds and blossomed into a close friendship, with Cage coming to visit on more than one occasion. David Tudor followed a few years later with the Moog in tow. The recordings ran from 1969 to 1973, and after that, not much. Electronic music at the NID seemed to be over as soon as it began. So what happened? Alexander Keep is a journalist who wrote an essay on the Moog, or Moog for the purists, at the NID. What happened to it in the end?
Essentially, students were not given access to much of this equipment. Why? Because if it breaks, they're not going to be able to fix it. So what happens is a kind of everything goes under lock and key, and over time it falls into disuse, and at some point it was essentially auctioned off.
Given the possibility for this moment to represent the birth of an Indian avant-garde within electronic music. Why do you think it didn't go further from there?
The NID was not an art school and was not a music school, but a design school. There isn't a kind of institutional structure around it that is promoting these sorts of musical experiments. The Moog system and its arrival sits at a kind of pivot point in NID's history. It's also around this time that NID finds itself in a quandary. The Ford Foundation, US-based NGO, which has been funding NID since its founding, was pulling out its financial support right around the time the Moog arrived. The Moog had been seen as this final piece of frivolity that would end the relationship.
The days of radical teaching and visiting luminaries were numbered. Under government pressure, the NID changed hands in the early 70s. The Sarabhais left, and the culture shifted. Thinking about India more broadly, does it speak to a larger shift that may have been happening within that moment?
Independent India turns 20 in 1967. And when India turns 20, there's a great deal of angst in the country, actually. It's a sort of gut check moment for the nation as a whole. Till then, you do find a country that's experimenting with things like the establishment of the NID. And by the late 60s, there's more of a sort of cynicism setting in around some of these dreams. And also this big question, like, what is a Moog good for in a country like India in a time like 1969? How can a Moog help India? And if the answer ends up being nothing much, that's part of the problem.
It struck me just how incredible it was that these recordings were made at all. It was only due to a combination of forces, all converging at that time, that for a few brief years, the Institute was a centre for experimentation. India was dreaming, but this particular dream was short-lived. The Moog was parcelled off to a former student in an animal sanctuary on the outskirts of town, and the tapes were boxed up and pushed into a cupboard. And that was that for experimental electronic music in India. Or was it? Not quite. While electronic music didn't explode in India as it did in the West, there have been some notable exceptions. In 1983, a Bollywood composer produced a record designed to capitalise on the Desi disco craze. It was called 10 Ragas to a Disco Beat. It featured a series of traditional ragas performed on a synthesizer, and it was to transform the history of Indian electronic music.
I was writing The Hub, which is India's first anthology of electronic music. And the question came up that when did it start? Somebody pointed out, have you heard 10 ragas to a disco beat? We were like, what is that? So we heard it for the first time in the end of 2009, and it was like, what is this? Who is this guy?
When I first heard 10 ragas, I was utterly in shock. It sounded more like an acid house record, which would have come out of Chicago years later. It was a big moment, not just for me, but for a lot of musicians in the South Asian diaspora. It was like discovering a godfather.
For me, that was like a model, like nobody done that model, and it's not like some guy from Detroit can think like that, and neither can a guy from Birmingham or Sheffield or London can think like that.
vk3sl.
Samrat B is a musician and music writer. The discovery of Charanjit Singh gave electronic musicians in India, like Samrat, a history of their own.
This is basically a clone, a very famous synthesizer which Roland made in the early 80s, as you can hear it here. It can play various kinds of tunes, tones which are in tune, like it's not in tune, but now it's in tune. The thing is that India didn't have any electronic music context, and for every kind of music that happens in India, one needs a historic context because we are such a society that it has to have a legacy,
It's a good groove, that one. I like it.
For us, the context never rose out of India, The context rose out of what was arriving at the shores of India. So, for example, for us, the discovery of Charanjit Singh was a very interesting time to know that people before us, way before us, were also doing much more interesting things without a context. Which also brings me back to this new discovery that you guys have had, like the Moog tapes in NID, which again makes me think that people were trying to do things without a context.
How does it feel for you to learn about these tapes at NID?
It's exciting. It's clearly exciting, but one wants to hear it.
Let's put on some tapes. Yes.
It straight takes me back to the time of Delia Derbyshire, Daphne Oram, and Pierre Schaeffer, and all these guys who were breaking the rules of music itself. Kind of whatever tells me that people were doing similar things with the similar machines. It's amazing to hear it now.
Thinking about that moment and the potential impact for that type of experimentation with the Moog, why do you think that didn't evolve further into some kind of experimental avant-garde music culture within India?
It's the same reason that Charanjit's initial recording or the record just sank without a trace. There was nothing around it to either support it, or there was no context for it to bounce off. And this you're talking about at least 1.5 decades earlier, right? It had no context.
"50 years on from the NID's heyday, I was curious to know how technology is shaping Indian composition today. A growing middle class is gaining access to equipment, touring internationally, and connecting with an audience on social media. And now a nascent independent music scene is challenging Bollywood's reign. I went to meet electronic musician Sanaya Ardashir, who records under the name Sandunes, in her home in the lush outskirts of Mumbai.
We're just by the ocean, even though you can't hear it, it's just down over there. The noise floor, really speaking, is traffic and crows, and then people selling things that I just know by heart.
We don't talk enough about how much of our culture is determined by the sound of a place.
Look at the number of cats in there because we're by the fish market. Did you see them?
Like, I definitely think there's certain aspects of being Indian that
have to do with the level of noise pollution.
When we arrived in Mumbai, we were instantly hit by a wall of sound in the city. Deafening horns, swerving cars, all things that Sanaya tries to capture in her work.
It must be 12:30.
Is he selling something?
He's buying from you, all your raddi.
Bric-a-brac.
Yeah. This noise floor is a part of pretty much all of the recordings that go into all of my finished music, because if I'm recording it here, it's outside my window, so I can't escape it.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask about some of the pieces that you've made that have been working with recordings in Mumbai.
The music I'm making, if it is void of any Hindustani classical tradition, that music was questioned on its Indianness. This was a very direct way for me to be like, well, here the entire palette is constructed locally, so this is local music. So here you've got all my various street sounds.
What was that sound that we just heard?
It was the clinks of the weights falling on the tray at Shivaji Market. Because I'm a big South Indian food fan, I got a dosa batter ladle on the cast iron thing, which honestly, when I hear the sound, I taste the dosa.
So within India at the moment, how does the electronic music scene feel like?
I feel like it is a very exciting time. It is a phenomenon that began in tandem with a certain socio-economic expansion. But I think that when you compare electronic music movements in the East and in the West, it feels like the accessibility factor and the sort of rebellion factor is in such a contrast to here, where it is not accessible. If you're making music in India, there's a certain privilege associated with it, sure. But I think there is this willingness to consume culture now, which is new.
I found a set of tapes a few years ago in the National Institute of Design. In my own music and my own journey, I think I'd always been looking towards Western composers to navigate my way through electronics.
Right.
And so to discover that there was a community of composers that were Indian, that were working within this tradition was kind of mind-blowing, actually.
Right, I'm sure.
How do you feel when you hear about this story?
If I'm honest, it's a little bit sad that it didn't make its way to the surface. I'm half inspired because it's like, oh, it was happening. And at the same time, it's like, oh, what a lost opportunity.
So I'd also like to play some of the music as well from the tapes.
It.
So let's see, let's pull one out and play it to you.
Cool. Cool. What? Man, this is the thing that I like most about instrumental electronic music, is that you told me where that's from and from when that's from, but had you not, this could have been from yesterday, and it could totally have been from like the San Francisco Tape Music Center, you know? It's so free of any baggage. It's amazing.
How does it feel to listen to a world of music that's come from this moment, and does that speak to you as an artist?
This is deeply exciting. The picture that the phrase electronic music paints take me to a place that does have a Western origin. It's interesting to think that that picture has been painted by a very limited set of discoveries that have not included
several things that were happening in other parts of the world. And if that history and that lineage becomes more talked about and known, then I'd feel more comfortable saying, yeah, I belong to that. Because it's like, there you go, there's the Indian electronic music flag. It was happening here in the 60s, so that's tons of decades. How can you refute that?
vk3sl.
The history of electronic music in India is fragmented. It's characterized by brief blasts of noise and long sections of silence. And as with any history, the significance of these chapters depends on who's telling the story.
You can hear with your eyes and see with your ears. And why not? Atul, what do you think are the ways in which one can popularize electronic music?
This music must realize the vast potentials lying in this sound world.
I think it also has a tremendous scope in drama, films, and I think most of all in radio.
Electronic India was presented by Paul Purgus. It was produced by Alana Chance and is a reduced listening production for BBC Radio 3. All of Radio 3's Sunday features are available as a podcast.
This is vk3sl. We've been testing on 160 metres narrowband FM mode and listening to this remarkable documentary. I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think there's a lot more avant-garde electronic music antecedents out there waiting to be discovered, and it'll be interesting to search further and develop this topic. Okay, I think we're almost ready to wind up, but before we do, I'd like to see if I can find the there's a recording here of the first tape recorded with the first almost hi-fi recording made on tape. It was recorded with the AEG magnetophone prototype. It's the prototype machine, the father of all tape machines, and it happens to be a recording of a cellist, which is quite significant for me. So I think we'll wind up with this today, and yeah, have a listen. This is where it all began. This is the foremost, the antecedent, the first time that the tape recorder had been used in any official capacity. And I think we'll wind up with this. And until next time, this is vk3sl.